you very much, Nicolo. Since we just had lunch, I thought I avoid all quantitative analysis. I will do a more qualitative and more traditional historical um, presentation. So let me start. Sorry. Sorry for spoiling. Thank you. Right. So let me start again with an admittedly very obvious observation. Namely, in every written source and every text type, we can find or look at individual statements, proposals from a temporal orientation. And we can simply distinguish between retrospective or past-oriented statements, between present or timeless orientation, and between future orientation. And if we look at different types of sources or text genres, then we find different types of orientation, and we can also find that different types of sources will have different focuses in temporal terms. So if we look at letters, we have both past and future, as well as, although less present-oriented statements. So past-oriented mostly are news, reports of past activities, of past events, mostly in the recent past. We sometimes have descriptions of present situations or even reflections on timeless aspects in the world, for example, certain rules. And we have plans, so future coordination and expectations. And just as the past horizon, so the future horizon, mostly relatively short term, as we have in a number of presentations so far. When we look at contracts and testaments, they are usually much more focused on the future. So past or present aspects are usually included in the legitimization, so to legitimize the determinations that are taken or described for the future. The future horizon is one, of course, determinations, what ought to happen, what is supposed to happen, and trying to fix that. And they include conditions or scenarios of what might happen and what would be the consequences of that. Now, admittedly, one can argue with the mid and long-term orientation that I jotted down here. So, of course, testaments can be quite short-term and contracts can be quite long-term. So this is just for the sake of simplification. And in the case that we are going to look at in the following minutes, we can make this distinction between mid and long-term, and I will explain a little bit further of what I mean by that. Now, what I want to look at more precisely is how these source types interacted, how the temporal and future horizons in these sources were interacting. And what these two arrows are supposed to symbolize here is that we can see the letters discuss contracts in particular, and how both future horizons mingle in the letters, and how the letters in turn influence a testament, although the testament is not explicitly discussed. So we have to see both of them together to better understand the future horizon, but it is only implicit in these. So in the following, I will give a brief introduction to the Tucher Trading Company. Then I will talk about testaments and how they're related to letters, and then about contracts and how they are related to letters. The Tucher Company in the first half of the 16th century was led usually by 2 to 3 partners in the family in successive generations. So I see here Anthony, Martin, and Hans Tucher, followed by Linhard and Lorenz Tucher. Linhard Tucher was the son of Anthony Tucher, and Lorenz Tucher was the son of Martin Tucher, and they were leading the company together, although there was usually one with the ultimate decision. That was first Anthony Tucher and then Linhard Tucher. And I mark Linhard Tucher in bold here because he is the one who received almost all the letters that I have been looking at. So he collected the letters, he was addressed, and he also, as far as we can see, decided which letters we still have nowadays, because the actual company letters were thrown away, but the personal letters, a selection of the personal letters, were stored and are still available. Now, apart from these leaders who were sitting in Nuremberg and managing the company from there, we have a number of apprentices, servants, and factors. By factors, I mean branch managers, or at least leading servants who had a large range of responsibilities within the firm, who were working in European trading centers. Most of them were younger family members, younger cousins, sons of Linhard and Lorenz Tucher, and also hired employees. So as we can see on this map, Nuremberg is, of course, the center from where the firm was managed. We have the second important branch in Lyon with the important fairs. There's a growing branch in Antwerp. At this time, it was still a relatively small branch with just 1 to 2 employees working there, and most of them, and also most of the letters, were sent from Lyon. The Tuchers were engaged in all kinds of trade, like many family companies at that time. They traded with anything that promised profit, but they had a strong focus on metal products that were exported from Nuremberg and saffron that was bought in Spain, in Catalonia and Aragon, also in Italy, in L'Aquila, but mostly in Spain, and then transported to Lyon, and then further towards Nuremberg, and then to Eastern Europe. Now, the main sources that I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, a testament by Linhard Tucher from the year 1565, 3 years before his death. Then a contract of one of their factors, Jakob Reuter, from the year 1533. There's also a summary, it's basically just a note by Linhard Tucher summarizing negotiations of a follow-up contract 8 years later, but we are going to focus on the actual contract. Finally, the letter collection, for which the Tuchers are very well known, that begins in the late 15th century, but most of the letters start around the year 1519 with an outbreak of the plague in Nuremberg and reach until roughly 1550. The last letter is from 1566, years before Linhard Tucher's own death. So this letter archive does not only contain letters, also some notes and accounts, but most of them are letters that concern a lot of different issues. Most important, obviously, trade, also staff management, by which I mean members of the company have to be sent to certain places, have to be at certain places at certain times, have to take care of certain things. All this was discussed in the letters. Politics, education, epidemics, as well as personal and family matters. And I'm going to focus here on staff management via the contracts and on education, which is related to the testament of Linhard Tucher. I've already said addressees were Antony and Linhard Tucher, most importantly Linhard Tucher, and most of the letters were written by company members. There are also a few other letter writers, but the bulk of the letters that we will be looking at was written by sons and actors. Now, a testament, or in particular this testament, has a generational temporal horizon. So Linhard Tucher here focuses at his children and heirs, at the next generation, and as he states explicitly at the beginning, to prevent conflicts between my heirs. What interests us here, however, is the end of the last will, where Linhard Tucher turns to his capital, what I have put in trade, as he says. Now, here, going to quote, he states, "This our elders, my dear father Antony, Hans, and Martin Tucher, blessed, kept in secret," so their documents, "and afterwards my cousin Lorenz Tucher and I, Linhard Tucher, did the same for all sorts of good reasons. It is my last will, opinion, and command that, following my death, these documents shall not be opened to anyone else than my 3 sons, as they will be alive and suited for trade, as they are now Paulus, Gabriel, and Herding Tucher." Explicitly referred to the past generation, to his own generation, and then the next generation. They should be following the same practices, which, and he goes on and on with that, is mostly focused on keep the company internal documents secret yourself, follow a number of established practices. However, there were more than these three sons of Linhard Tucher alive at that point, and all of them were trained to be merchants. So we also have Sixtus Tucher and Levinus Tucher alive at that point. It here shows Paulus Tucher, his oldest son, together with Ursula Scheuer, the daughter of a certain Christoph Scheuer that was mentioned yesterday. It's not exactly clear why Sixtus and Levinus Tucher were included, but we will see that there are some hints. So Levinus Tucher was sent for his education abroad very late when he was already 16. And sometimes in some letters, the Tuchers give explanations when somebody has trouble, especially with calculations, that they may be a bit too old. And the problem may simply have been that he was considered too old to have started his education and therefore not suited for trade. So we are going to look at the education, the training to be a merchant in the letters now. First step that usually appears in letters is find a good master, which usually is the first step in the education, 2 years. I have brought a short quote, the preparations for Paulus Tucher and the second eldest son, Christoph Tucher, who is not alive anymore at the time of the testament, in a letter by a cousin of Linhard. I have read that you plan to send your 2 sons to Lyon at Easter and asked me to forward a letter to the son of Michael von Kaden in Bourg. I also asked whether there are good honorable merchants in Bourg who would be suitable to take in his 2 sons. Moreover, he wants Paulus to be sent to Latin school on a daily basis. So what we see here, there are a number of decisions to be made that are made again and again for every individual son. They choose a different city, they choose particular masters that have that choice is very important for them to be educated. And we also see that Paulus Tucher is to be sent to Latin school. And he's the only one where this is stressed again, that he is supposed to learn Latin. He's also sent to university later on, but he never gives a clear explanation of why exactly Paulus is supposed to do that, and no one. Now, the following steps after this first part of the education at a master is that their skills afterwards and their behavior are assessed, and then there follows a second period of the education within the company for another 2 to 3 years for more specialized training, and that means for Linhard Tucher's sons that they are employed in the saffron trade. So first they just accompany a saffron investment, and over the years they will take more and more responsibilities. And that always depends on their suitability. So are they doing a good job or not? I'm mostly going to focus now for the case of Sixtus Tucher. Suitability. And suitability consists mainly of 2 aspects, namely the skills and second, the behavior, because the behavior is important for the reputation. And without a good reputation, the business cannot be continued. So Sixtus Tucher had no problem with his skills or his talents. That was always fine. But in the second part of his education, there are a number of letters complaining about his impertinence and his stubbornness and not willing to. Letter writers tend to switch between observations of improvement and giving up. And show you a few examples here. Since your last letter, his behavior has improved so that one can work with him. Hope he will continue to better himself with every day. This is why he should not be given up yet, because a misplaced stone may still become a cornerstone. Don't worry, he will do well. He will still become a righteous person, you will see. So you can do things here. Firstly, he will become a righteous person. That is what is important here. Not he will become a good merchant in the sense of skills, but a virtuous person that can represent the family and keep up the reputation. But you also see that in the beginning, a misplaced stone may still become a cornerstone. So there's uncertainty, and he ends with a much more convincing voice. Don't worry, he will do well. Everything will turn out fine. Although if we look at the overall context, this certainty was certainly rather low. He also makes a particular observation about a rule of how to treat young people, and they return a bit to age and life cycles again. One must be patient and guide the young until reason comes. What the young see before themselves, they want to do and understand immediately, which leads to impertinent and ignorant tutoring. So one has to take certain measures at the right age, and according to the particular type of behavior, in order to avoid that they become persons that will be a threat to the success of the company. Now, all these problems are not untypical. He said the young. This means this happens a lot, especially with teenagers, also far into their 20s in some cases. Is by far not anything unusual. What becomes a problem is something that he probably did somewhere in the early 1550s when he was early 20s. And we only see this in one statement by a letter of Linhard Tucher to a younger cousin of his, regarding Six Tucher's bastard, and he really uses an insulting term here. I do not intend to make a nobleman out of him, and he may not expect anything from his father. I would have preferred that he had put him in the service of a common craftsman, not a merchant, so that he could learn a craft and be educated accordingly. So here we see the power of Linhard Tucher, who will basically decide, or at least wants to decide, which position in society his grandson should have. And this is probably also the reason we don't know, but this maybe have been a reason why Sixtus Tucher was excluded in the end from the testament and not even mentioned when it discusses his succession in the company. His behavior was simply too dangerous for the Tucher's reputation. Moving on to contracts, I forgot to take a picture of this contract, but I transcribed it, and I'm only going to read the first part of the contract. I, Jakob Reuter, hereby confirm and announce that I am committed to the Honorable Linhard and Lorenz Tucher as a servant in all their trade, how and wherever they will send or employ me to their needs, on horseback or on foot, for 10 years following upon each other, which shall begin on the first day of the month of August in the year 1533. Shall and will further their profit and protect them from losses. Everything shall be done faithfully and without danger. So as we see, first of all, this contract, in the most general sense, fixes a relationship for a specified period of 10 years. And this relationship is very much in the interest and in the regard to the certainty of the Tucher company, as we also see how and wherever they will send, or employ me to their needs. There's not much certainty in there for Jakob Reuter. What his future would look like in the next 10 years is not determined at all. He could be sent anywhere. He could be doing almost anything. This is certainly a very unbalanced separation or distribution of control in this contract. Now, what did these relationship processes look like? What we see here in the contract is just one part out of an ongoing long-term discussions about individual relationships with their employees. And just to briefly summarize this process is that it usually begins with observing that you need another candidate, you need another employee. You have to find a suitable candidate, a trustworthy one. They plan to work with somebody for 10 years. You have to be quite certain that this will be a good fit. You negotiate a contract with the condition. 10 years is rather long, so the contracts that they negotiated usually range between 4 and 10 years. After this first period, usually there were negotiations for a prolongation, and ideally this would be continued for a couple of times, sometimes even across several generations. And this was actually realized with one of the employees, Linhard Rottengatter, whose son would also be an apprentice in the company and then an employee in the Linhard Rottengatter, coming from Ulm, would become a member of the city council in Nuremberg. So almost an ideal, typical career within the company, though he never became a partner. More typical, however, is that they separated their paths after one or several contract periods. So every contract period, there was always a break and the future becomes open again. And it was not quite certain what would happen, and it would be renegotiated. And we're going to have a look at these negotiation periods. So in 1533, Lorenz-Tucher wrote to Linhart-Tucher, "We will need more people and not always get our opportunity. It should be all the better to take someone now. May God in his glory decide." So we see there too is a lot of uncertainty in here. It is quite difficult to find a good partner. It might, or a good employee. There might not always be some available. Basically, good employees are a scarce resource. And when he says we should be active now, it means amidst the outbreak of a plague. So we only have this letter because Lorenz-Tucher left Nuremberg for nearby Nördlingen and communicated via letter with his partner Linhart-Tucher. And this is when they begin to make negotiations for a long term, and they insist on a 10-year contract for a new employee. So both were in acute danger, but this is what we can also see here. They never considered that the company as such would be in danger, or that this would be uncertain when their life actually was uncertain. And the invocation of God here is actually quite untypical in this context. When they talk about staff management, this is usually something that they considered under their own control. But here, of course, he shows uncertainty by referring to God. In the beginning, they had two candidates, Linhart Rottengatter. Their factor was sent to Ulm, where he had grown up and probably had good connections, and supposed to find a suitable candidate. And he presented two of them. A fine boy of about 20 years who can speak French and is from good people. I think if you shall see him, you would like him. I think one could hire him for 8 or 10 years. The other one was also from good people, equipped with surety, but who does not speak French, which basically ruled him out immediately because he was to be sent to Lyon. Now, I just want to point out another interesting thing. If you see these two rows of numbers, this is part of the debate of the distribution of the salary. So Lorenz-Tucher sent two options of how to spend his salary over the course of 10 years. The overall salary would be 200 florin. That was clear from the beginning, but he suggested two ways to distribute this over 10 years. So you have to read from the bottom up. First 2 years, nothing. Then the second 2 years, 40, again, 40, 50, and 70. And the other option was similarly nothing for the first 2 years, then 30 florin, 40 florin, 50, and 80. This was comparatively low salary, so more experienced factors could earn much more, but he was only 20 years old. It was relatively risky to take someone in since they didn't know him personally. So this is why they started with no salary at the beginning and a relatively low salary as well. Let's move now to prolongation scenarios. So usually we do not see these negotiations for a prolongation of the contract. Usually somebody would be called to Nuremberg and then they would discuss that in person. In one case, the factor Vincent Sperghammer in Lyon started these negotiations already in some of his letters. I tell you truthfully that a certain lord has followed me for a long time through various countries and presented a good business to me. But I haven't told anyone, nor want to answer him before I have informed you and heard your opinion. You are happy with my services, and I am certain that you will pay me for these services appropriately, also considering that I spent my best time or days with you. You know yourself that one must consider this one while is still young and not stay until one gets old, since then it is too late. So obviously he is making a case for himself here to make himself more desirable. There are others who are interested in me and my knowledge, by the way, and they will pay me well, and I hope you will do the same. I also want to refer to Sanne's presentation here again when we're talking about age. And here age and the life cycle gets important again. So he points out to his own career, and he also points to a career outside the Tucher family. Apparently, he openly states here that there is a future for him outside the company. And just the fact that he presents this very openly here also suggests that he expects that this will be expected. It is a legitimate goal to say, I want to have my own company outside this company later on. And this is something that you have to consider if you want to keep me. So improve your conditions. Vincent Perkhammer would continue his contract, but a few years later, I think about 8 years later, he left the company and actually he made a very successful career in Augsburg. So his plan would work out. Let's look at another example where they're actually separated paths. And this was written shortly after Effector Gregorius Heipel left the company. It's not quite clear whether he was fired or whether he left on his own terms. But here, Gabriel Tucher, Linhard Tucher's son, wrote, I was worried that Gregory Heipel's new lordship would employ him in Spain, where the saffron trade takes place, which would not have been to your and others' benefit, especially since he had good knowledge from the past Campania. But I think he will keep this to himself as is appropriate. Yet I hear from others that when their service for their lordship has ended, they are obliged not to trade at the places where their former lordship used to trade. So, first of all, there is, although he states the opposite, there is definitely some doubt that this former factor will not abuse his knowledge and their trust to sell it to his new masters and use that against them. And what I have not mentioned when I was showing the contract is that there is one clause in this contract that goes beyond the 10 years, namely that every factor is obliged to keep everything he knows about the company to himself for his lifetime. This is the one part that goes beyond 10 years. This is to be kept forever for the rest of his lifetime. But we see there is some doubt as soon as he has left the company, because of course they cannot quite observe that, they cannot check nor control that precisely. Moreover, what Gabriel Tucher hints at here in the end, when he says, I heard from others, change the way these contracts are concluded. So he basically makes takes back a step and looks at the practices of how they construct their contracts, which clauses are included, what should be anticipated in these contracts and avoided as far as possible. Namely, they are obliged not to trade at the places where they have worked for the former company. I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention.